Today we're going to discuss a popular 2025 release, which is The Madwife by Meagan Church. This is going to be an interesting video because if you are familiar with my channel, you might know that I'm not a huge fan of making spoiler-free book reviews. So this is not a spoiler-free book review. This is a discussion of the book that is going to include reading passages directly from the book and discussing what the book and the author is trying to do, what she did well, and also a huge critique at the end of the video. This is not a video that requires you to have read the book, which is unique in a way. I will give you enough context about everything that the book is doing for you to be able to join in the conversation without having ever read a single page. Meagan Church is an author with a very specific goal, and she has released several books by now. Her goal, in her own words, is, "My books all follow seemingly typical women who find themselves up against a difficult moment in our nation's past." Our nation referring to the United States. "My hope is that these stories and others like them can shed light on women's experiences throughout our history so we can do better, be kinder, give grace, and extend empathy." This goal of hers does come through in her book, and I think that she does several things well, and there are several topics that we will bring up to show what she has done with that within the context of this particular book, The Madwife. But by the end of the video, I'm also going to get into a major critique for why I think this book fell very short of what it could have been because of potentially a marketing decision that affected the book, but also just potentially a decision that Meagan Church chose to make that I really think undermined a lot of the work and effort she put into the first several hundred pages of this book. Before we get into that critique at the end of the video, which will definitely have a discussion that I want you to join, let's talk about some of the things that she did in this book that were at least somewhat effective in order to give context to what we're even talking about. Suburbia versus rural living. This book follows LuLu directly after having her second baby in 1950s American suburbia. The book specifically does not choose a specific location because it's just supposed to have the feel of suburbia overall. However, LuLu, the main character of this book, was raised on a farm and is not used to suburban living and doesn't always love it. At one point in the book, LuLu looks back on her husband's proposal to her when they were in college because at that point she wondered if they could have a good marriage given she was a farm girl and he was a little bit more of an upper middle class suburban boy. She says, "I didn't know how the two of us would work. He was too optimistic for his own good and for our reality. His world was not mine. The fields of my childhood, the woods so deep and full, the pond with its dark water, all were as foreign to him as the need for multiple forks beside a dinner plate was to me." We notice throughout the book several times that LuLu chafes against the expectations of suburbia and what is expected of a suburban wife because she is not used to seeing that as she was raised on a farm in a very more rural lifestyle. And we also notice throughout the book that the message with this is LuLu is expected to 100% fit into Henry, her husband's life, and there isn't very much of a need for Henry to learn about her past or her background because she is living in his world. This theme actually starts on page 1 where LuLu wishes that Henry would have picked out one of the houses in the neighborhood that had trees, but instead he picked out a house with a backyard that didn't have very much greenery, which makes her feel even more separated from her childhood that was surrounded by nature. LuLu also has a hard time with the schedule that a lot of suburban wives seem to keep. She says, "When we first moved, I had no idea a suburban housewife's life came with such a schedule. Of course, we always had chores to do on the farm, some daily, such as feeding the horses and mucking the stalls, while others were seasonal, like harvesting and canning. but my parents never had a printed schedule that told them how to spend each day, never had the peering eyes of neighbors to contend with. To LuLu, this suburban culture feels very artificial because although she did have to do a lot of work as a child on a farm, it all seemed to have a real concrete purpose, whereas a lot of the things she feels she is expected to do in suburbia are not as directly connected to a necessity, but rather to her feel like a way of keeping up appearances. This is highlighted even more by the fact that LuLu tries really hard to fit in with the neighborhood culture and becomes known as the queen of molded food, basically food encased in Jell-O, those really gross looking 1950s Jell-O salads. If you love those, that's totally fine. I think they're kind of gross. But LuLu also thinks they're kind of gross, which is part of what this is trying to say. She says, "It wasn't a role I had planned for myself, but I accepted the title, even if I didn't eat half of what I made." She didn't even eat a lot of this food that she made to fit in with her community, but she was still given the title Queen of Molded Food, which kind of highlights the fact that she thinks it's somewhat artificial and she doesn't feel like she completely fits in, but she's trying really hard to fit into her husband's culture, even when she has to do sort of 100% of the work to be able to have this relationship work. Her nighttime solace throughout the book is spending time with a neighborhood cat that reminds her of all the animals that she grew up with on the farm and gives her some sort of connection to the life she had before. I think this point that the book is trying to make is definitely fair. There are so many times throughout my life where I have heard the advice that it's a lot easier if you marry someone or end up with someone that has a similar background to you. Now, I've seen so many people challenge that idea and have very successful marriages, and there is definitely some sort of truth to the idea that two people in love can form a joint culture from two separate backgrounds. But what the book is really trying to get at is LuLu is having to do 100% of the work to fit into Henry's world, and Henry isn't having to reciprocate by doing anything to fit into her world. I imagine this reality has definitely been true for many women throughout history. Stamps and self-expression. Throughout the book, LuLu is obsessed with collecting and redeeming stamps. It actually gets a little bit annoying as the reader, in my opinion, because the book refers to stamps so often. But I think it is one of the primary things the book is trying to do, because it's trying to show us that LuLu is trying to have some sort of self-expression, and she's trying to make her space her own, despite not actually having an income that she can choose how to spend. She says, "Perhaps I was trying to put some soul into our house with the items I earned, or at least remove the spirit that had infected it before we moved in. Mrs. Mayfield, yes, my mother-in-law, insisted I call her that, had taken upon herself to furnish our home, from the living and dining rooms to the very bedroom where her son slept. In addition to just decorating her home by using stamps, which she does do throughout the book to make the space feel her own and to have some self-expression, she is continually thinking about an upgraded camera. She has a camera and her favorite hobby is photography, but the camera she has does not do all of the things that she would like it to do, and she wants to have a better one. She talks many times about how she's trying to save stamps to get the best camera that can be redeemed with stamps, yet it never quite happens. In addition to that, the camera she really wants cannot be redeemed with stamps, which shows that no matter what she does, she can't necessarily ever get exactly what she wants because of the limitations put on her in the role that she's in. She says, "Henry was always telling me to take up a hobby, find more ways to fill my day, and photography was the closest I had to one. For months, I planned to redeem my stamps for that camera, but something always came first." Her main hope was that Henry might realize that she wanted a camera and buy her the camera for Christmas. Maybe she sort of mentioned it in passing, but not super directly. However, he does not buy her a camera. Within the story, he buys her a pair of slippers. And I get the critique of this that it would be a lot more helpful if she was more direct in her communication, because throughout the book, her speech patterns are very indirect in what she's trying to say. She does not directly express her wants and desires to her husband because she's afraid that somehow expressing what she wants directly will come across as ungrateful, when in reality she is grateful for what he has done for her. I myself am a very direct communicator, and I generally say exactly what I want from people in a way that I think is efficient, because that is my personality, not in a way that is demanding. I would never demand anything of anyone, but if someone asked me what I wanted for Christmas, I would just tell them what I wanted for Christmas. But I have seen so many women of older generations, primarily my grandmother, who have learned very indirect speech patterns. They have learned how to talk about what they want, but in a very passive way or even passive-aggressive way. And I think within the context of the power dynamics that exist in this sort of situation, that makes a lot of sense. When the man tends to have a lot of the power because of the setup, if that trust relationship is not 100% logged in, it makes sense that the person that has a little bit more of the submissive role or a little bit less of the power will try to take on these other speech patterns that in a way can get in the way of being efficient and making everyone happy. She basically understands the position she is in and the position her husband is in, and this seems to even impact her speech patterns and how she asks for things. Marriage, love, and power. In a minute, we're going to talk about the focal point of this book, which is the inclusion of hysteria. That is basically a misdiagnosis. This is the point of the Mad Wife. But before we get into that part of the book, I want to talk about the marriage between LuLu and Henry a little bit more directly, because I think the author made a really interesting choice with this. Basically, throughout the book, LuLu is a little bit paranoid that Henry might not be as in love with her as he was before. She's worried about his secretary, who is young and beautiful. She's worried that she's not interesting for him anymore, especially after having her second baby and having some mental health issues. And she's worried that he might not even fully love her and that he might make some medical decisions for her that will make her uncomfortable, or will actually, in her mind, have huge impacts on her life. We'll get into that medical section in a bit. But the book does something really interesting, because by the end of the book, we realize that Henry is in love with his wife, and he wants the best for her, and he is legitimately trying to do his best, but they just don't have very good communication patterns, partially because of that speech thing that I talked about a minute ago. So we see Henry trying, but it's not ever enough for what LuLu needs. I'm going to give a specific example. At one point in the book, LuLu is very overwhelmed, so she buys a bunch of frozen dinners from the store. Of course, this is kind of early days for frozen dinners, and frozen dinners have always been gross and are still gross compared to home-cooked meals. Henry believes he's being very supportive of LuLu because when she serves these dinners to her family, their son Wesley complains, and Henry reminds Wesley that they need to be grateful for whatever LuLu provides them and whatever she puts on the table. However, we realize that Henry is actually not okay with these frozen dinners because he's trying to find a solution to them. And one day he comes up to LuLu and addresses her and says he thinks he's figured it out and he's going to solve the problem so that their family can go back to normal and so she could perform how she did before she had her second baby. He says, "I mean, at first I thought you just needed some time and then you'd come around. But it has been a few weeks now, and we've had those dinners each night, and the more I started thinking, the more I realized you don't want to have to clean all those dishes. So if we get a dishwasher, it'll make the job easier, right?" LuLu internally muses to herself about how that's not going to solve anything, and about how it doesn't get at the core of the issue that she's struggling with internally, but externally she tells him, "Yes, that is great, thank you," which creates more of this problem in the marriage. She basically fears what he can do to her if she doesn't seem to quickly bounce back and recover. And we'll get into the medical part of that in a minute. Basically, he makes her medical decisions, so she's afraid that if she doesn't look like she's getting back to normal and performing like she did before, that he might make some more drastic decisions for her health. When the dishwasher actually comes, LuLu discovers it's one of those dishwashers that does not go into the cabinetry, or is that how you say it? You know, like one of those dishwashers that actually is installed into your house, like basically every dishwasher in 2025. But instead, it's a dishwasher that sits in the middle of the kitchen floor and attaches itself to the sink, and then she can like put it away in the pantry, which doesn't have space for it. So it becomes this giant nuisance in the kitchen and like blocks her path to be able to get to her refrigerator and to be able to do different things. And she doesn't really like it. But because it was the solution that her husband came up with, she can't really say anything bad about it because she's trying to appear like a perfect recovered housewife that's going to bounce back to normal. So the point is, even if Henry ultimately loves her and is actually trying to do things to fix the problem and is actually trying to figure out what's going on, and he's also dealing with very indirect communication coming from his wife, even if he's trying, it's just not enough. Hysteria, medical bias, and fear. All of this commentary of the marriage makes a lot more sense if you realize the context that this is happening in, which is this medical problem that we've been talking about. So after LuLu has her second child, she does not bounce back. She is very under the weather, depressed, does not act like she normally does, really struggles to keep up appearances, has struggling relationships with her neighbors, whom she's had a good relationship with in the past. She's serving these subpar frozen dinners, and everyone can kind of tell that she is not doing as well as she did after the birth of her first child. More on that in a minute. So the doctor comes and prescribes her Miltown. Is that how you pronounce it? It's basically like the pill that they gave almost every housewife that was struggling with something like this in the 1950s. The doctor says that she's physically right as rain, but that she is suffering from hysteria or from housewife syndrome, so she needs to be able to take these pills. LuLu doesn't really like the pills. They make her life very hazy. She doesn't like what they do to her, and she doesn't really want to take them. So for a period of time, she stops taking them, but then she starts taking them again at a point where she wants everything to go well so that nothing worse happens to her. And this all fits within the context of her discovering what a lobotomy is. The neighborhood women gossip about women who have had to have lobotomies, basically severing a part of their brain, and how it might have affected some women. Now, they don't really know anyone who's gotten a lobotomy until LuLu is snooping around a neighbor's house when she's over there for a social visit, and finds out that one of the women in her neighborhood had a lobotomy, and she can kind of tell that it's affected this woman. It says, diagnosis, depression, medical condition, treatment resistant, procedure, lobotomy, prognosis, compliance behavior. This starts the central conflict of the book. LuLu is terrified that if she is not able to recover from the use of pills, or from some other sort of treatment, and recover in a way that other people can tell that she's better, and that her husband can tell that she's better, that she might be eventually put on a much more drastic treatment plan, which could eventually lead to a lobotomy if she were not to visibly recover. One day, Henry asks if LuLu thinks the pills are helping, and then she again does not give a direct answer or an accurate answer, because internally she says to herself, the real question was, did he think they were helping? I didn't tell him how the pills made me feel. My senses more clouded than a typical day, my thoughts no longer wandering, because my mind was too dulled to even think. This shows again how LuLu is unable to give honest feedback to her loving husband because she has this paranoia in the back of her mind that he will make medical decisions for her that she doesn't want if she doesn't appear to recover. Then, in my opinion, at this point, the book goes completely off the rails and undermines everything that it does up to this point that we've already discussed by choosing something so over-the-top, exaggerated, and extreme. The last 50, I don't even know exactly how many pages it is, but the last part of the book, LuLu has a little bit more of a mental break, and that needs to be addressed. And then we discover that the second child she had that I referred to a couple times in this video was actually born stillborn, and LuLu has been carrying around a blanket, like a swaddled blanket that's just empty, thinking that her child is still alive. So that definitely contextualizes how worried Henry is throughout the book, because she actually did have a very extreme symptom being shown beyond what we thought being so close to LuLu. And a lot of people have said this with the context, this twist was somewhat predictable. I don't care about the predictability of the twist. I kind of care about what this does to the message of the book. So she is sent to the sanatorium. She is put under intensive medical care. She's given what is called electroconvulsive therapy, which she hates, and the doctor tells her she needs to do it over and over and over again, and it's definitely not helping her, and it's making her even worse, to the point that when Henry comes to visit to talk to the doctor and see how she's doing, she steals the keys from him, runs home to her mom, and her mom almost immediately diagnoses her with lupus. Basically, the whole point of the book is that all the doctors, with their biases, were misdiagnosing her and not seeing some of the obvious signs that were clearly lupus, and because of that, she was put on treatments that made her worse. I am actually okay with that message, because it is true that throughout history, a lot of women have been misdiagnosed. A lot of research has not been done into women's health. And lupus is a condition that primarily affects women and can be kind of hard to diagnose. So all of that, stamp of approval. What I did not like is that this book chose the most drastic, borderline absurd and unrealistic example to make its point. A normal case of lupus would not look like a woman carrying around a blanket for months, not knowing that her child had died. That is possible. It is extreme. And it lends into this whole problem where it's turning something that the author wants to be a little bit more of a literary fiction, historical fiction piece into a thriller to attract a certain thriller audience. This shouldn't have been a thriller. When you look at the lower reviews for this book, the 1 stars, the 2 stars, the 3 stars on Goodreads, a lot of people tend to be in two camps. There are people who say, I loved what the beginning was doing and hated the ending. And then there are people who say, the beginning of this book was so boring, and finally we got the thriller twist at the end that made it okay. Meaning that the reader that went into this book to actually examine the themes in the case of more of a literary experience or historical fiction experience didn't like how it went off the rails. I'm a little bit in that camp. Even though I didn't hate this book, I probably would give it like a 3.5 stars, but I would definitely side with them. Whereas the people who went into this book expecting a thriller were like, wow, that was boring. There was barely any thriller elements until the very end. I personally think the book would have been better if the ending was a little bit less dramatic. You could still have misdiagnosis, you could still have lupus, because that's a very good choice for the time period, and very easy to be misdiagnosed, and you can still have a lot of the elements that she included at the end without it being such an extreme case, because to me it kind of says a normal case of a normal situation with a normal woman wasn't enough for this book. We had to exaggerate it to make a point, which kind of undermines the point that it is making, in my opinion. And it just wasn't set up as a thriller. Now, to be fair, I love thrillers that take on big topics, or horror books that take on big topics, given they feel like a thriller or horror book from the beginning. For example, earlier this year, I recommended Witchcraft for Wayward Girls, which is definitely horror first and then historical fiction second, and it worked. This historical fiction, literary fiction first, thriller second approach, I don't think worked at all. And I did figure out that she does kind of identify a little bit more as a literary fiction author, because she was asked the question, what do you hope readers will take away from this novel? To which she answers, studies show that readers who spend time reading literary fiction are more empathetic in their real lives, showing that she kind of self-identifies more with that literary fiction, historical fiction group, and less with the thriller one, which definitely comes across in the book. It does make me wonder if this is a little micro trend in publishing where you take a book that is primarily meant to be more of a serious exploration of ideas of a time period, and then you throw on a twist ending to increase readership. Because the other day I went into Barnes & Noble, and on the front table that's in the store, as soon as you walk into the store, there were probably at least 5 or 6 just like this. Books that are taking on serious topics and are definitely more historical fiction in what they are doing, but they are somewhat marketed to be a little bit thriller-esque and a little bit of a twist. And I'm wondering if it's trying to get more people to read these books. So my argument clearly is that I would have preferred it to not throw in that thriller ending unless it kind of felt like a thriller throughout the book, because I think it cheapened the overall message of the book. That is my take. That is my opinion. However, I can totally see the other side of this argument, because obviously these literary fiction, historical fiction, thriller hybrids are becoming really popular right now in this year and the last few years for a reason. It probably does get more people to read these books. It probably does get more people to examine the ideas, and there could be an argument to be made that by exaggerating to an extreme case what might happen in the real world, it brings problems to light in a more obvious way. To me, this undermines real problems because they shouldn't have to be taken to the extreme for people to take them seriously. However, there is totally the argument to be made that exaggerating the ending of stories like these makes these problems more visible, and since the authors are trying to make the problems visible, this could be seen as effective. I want your opinion on this. Do you like the idea of this historical fiction, literary fiction, thriller hybrid where it's literary fiction, historical fiction first, and thriller second, tacked on at the end? Do you think it's effective? Do you think it's a smart marketing strategy, and is it a good reason to get people to pick up a book that they otherwise might have ignored? Or would you prefer a book to stay more in that historical fiction, literary fiction realm and not try to do the hybrid approach? I do think that there is a situation where it could work, so let me know what you think on that topic. I might cover it again in the future because I find it extremely interesting that so many books are doing this right now. Thank you for watching.